Welcome, everybody, to the first Humanity versus Capitalism podcast. I'm Amos Carlin, and I have Zaheer Marali with me, and we're very excited to start this series where we're going to be discussing all kinds of matters related to this general theme of humanity versus capitalism, which is really all about how do we move our society to a better spot? How do we change the paradigms that we've been operating under for the past 100 years or so that feel like they're at a breaking point right now?
Hey everyone, really glad to be here with Amos. We're going to cover the A to Z on humanity and capitalism. And I think it's a way for us to look at how we can fashion the tools that are available to us to uplift humanity around the world.
The overall message that we want to impart is one of hope and one of using human ingenuity and technology to make the world a better place. We hear so many stories about how things are going in the wrong direction. I think a lot of people feel that things are hopeless, and we want to show an alternative to that. We're going to look at a talk that Kate Raworth gave fairly recently. Kate is an economist who works out of Oxford University, and she has some very transformative and very uplifting ideas that I think are actually also achievable. And I think that's one of the things that Zaheer and I really like about her message.
We're going to talk about things like GDP, a metric that we all have signed up for. That's only relatively recent. What does it actually mean, and how might it be reshaped to incorporate other parts of what it means to thrive as a society, to thrive as humanity, and to thrive alongside other living beings on this planet. So Kate walks us through a few of the ways in which she thinks about it. We talk about the nature of regenerative growth and things like that, and the stories that we believe. And we rarely question them. And I think this gives us an opportunity to pose a couple of questions about things we typically take for granted. And I'm looking forward to doing that with Amos here.
Great, let's get to it. So in today's podcast, we're going to be referencing ideas from Kate Raworth's book, Doughnut Economics. And one of the key points that she makes in the book is that the way that our countries work right now, we have economies that need to grow whether or not they make us thrive. And she says that what we need, especially in the richest countries, are economies that thrive whether or not they grow. And this whole idea of growth comes out of the metric of GDP, or gross domestic product, which represents simply the sum of products created in an economy in 1 year. It actually is not that old of a metric. It started in the 30s, but it very soon became the main metric by which countries measure their prosperity. And to this day, when countries feel that they have economic problems, again, especially in the richest countries, they seem to always feel that the answer lies in more growth, no matter what the hidden costs must be. So Kate Raworth really feels that we need to start moving away from these things.
It can sometimes feel like clever wordplay, but behind the clever wordplay is something quite profound, right? It asks you to change the order of operations in terms of how you think about what a business is for or what economies are for. And I think we've drifted from where businesses and societies were there to help people thrive, to help people get out of starvation, to help people find a better standard of living. And then they flipped into something that became about the wealth and the growth of wealth of the owners of those businesses. And they went from being service-oriented to being shareholder-oriented or owner-oriented. And I think that's what she's really speaking to, is an order of operations mentally for us that puts the thriving of a community ahead of the wealth opportunity for an owner.
Right.
And when you take that from a business level and you go to a country level, that's like the measure like GDP and things like that are how we would measure the wealth of a country. And if we're measuring the wealth of a country on a metric that is really just the sum of products and services, it leaves so much on the table that we're
Yeah.
completely missing.
Yep.
You interviewed Rianne around this and caregiving, like that's not even included in those numbers.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. We were lucky enough to interview Rianne Eisler a little while ago, who's really one of the, godmothers, I guess, of this type of thought. And she's been talking about having alternative metrics to the GDP for decades now. And, it's still not something that's widely accepted. I honestly think that one day it will be as our consciousness evolves, but, we're not there yet. But that's really so much of what this is about, right? Because when it's not all about dollars and cents, and, to Kate's point, she's saying that if we focus on thriving and not just growth, changes all the metrics, right? And it brings stuff like, if we can actually quantify happiness, right? How happy is a society, right? There are ways, presumably, or that we know of, to quantify that in certain ways and respects. Obviously, it's a lot harder to do than to say everybody has an average of $30,000 a year in salary, right? That's a much easier thing to quantify. But the more we move towards those kinds of metrics that say how happy is a society, what are the feelings of well-being that people have in general, feelings of true security, right? All these kinds of things, which I think if we had those metrics, a lot of our societies would fail miserably right now, as an average. So yeah, I think I think that her words there are really poignant, and that flip is very, very powerful.
What does it mean to thrive? Because I think that can be something that people get
Yeah.
hung up on too. What does thrive actually mean for people?
Yeah, great question. I mean, if I could take a stab at that, I think that, the first thing that comes to mind is what are people doing with their time, right? That's for some reason that's the first thing that came to mind. Meaning that, are people investing their time in things that they feel are worthwhile, that they are really invested in, not just because they're trying to make money to buy things or support their family or whatever it is, right? But beyond that, I think when you're thriving, that to me signifies that you are, you truly feel a part of what you're doing on a daily basis, mind, body, soul type of thing, right? And I think if we extrapolate that to a society, it becomes a society that feels that they have a common purpose, and it really, that really works as a community and as a communal society, right? Where everyone is moving towards the same goals and sharing in the same goals, which I think is certainly not the way our society is working now. The way that we look at ourselves and the way that we've adopted our own metrics, right? Of when we look at ourselves, are we successful? Are we happy? Are we worthy? All these kinds of things. The things that we're even measuring are just, whoa, they didn't even exist until so recently. So it's quite mind blowing.
Yeah, they've been sort of added to us,
Yeah.
and we've rarely questioned. I think, if anything, coming out of hearing Kate's piece is like the value of questions
Yes.
that we need to ask
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah. For sure. For sure. Okay.
Kate likes to talk about our addictions to growth. Companies need growth to keep their shareholders happy. Countries need growth to keep their engines running without having to raise taxes too much. And we, the people, as consumers, have become addicted to buying things, being told that the more we buy, the better our lives are going to be. And this is the real heart of the system. If we stop buying, the whole thing collapses. Our global GDP now is 10 times what it was in 1950. But as we know, so much of this prosperity has been sucked up by the top 1%. So, as Kate says, we need not only a system that is more efficient in terms of wealth distribution, but one that is also working within the bounds of our planetary system. The myth of endless growth is a dangerous one.
I think what Kate mentions here around our addiction to growth is deeply tied into something that started to happen post World War II. So it started in early days leading up to that, but it was around the rise of PR in the US and in Europe. And it was tied to the war effort. So the politicians were trying to galvanize public support for the war and for America to enter. And they stumbled across these ideas from Sigmund Freud that were being propounded by Edward Bernays, his nephew. And what they found was it was a really effective tool when used in a mass kind of media way to move people's opinion and move their actions towards supporting the war. And when that ended, they just applied the same techniques to now utilizing the surplus capacity that came out of the war into manufacturing goods. And basically it turned into, I think there's a documentary that Adam Curtis did on this called The Century of the Self, but it's the happiness machines. And so much went into fashioning, a bit like Kate talks about, like this sense of self that would be satisfied by purchasing more things, sort of a figment of your imagination, a future self that you wanted to invest in. And its satisfaction depended on you making these purchases along the way. There are going to be people that say more eloquently than that, but I think it really speaks to how these addictions aren't really ours. We tend to take on addictions as if something that we inherited from somebody or we're stuck with them or whatever, but they're not like that at all. They're actually just repetitive thoughts and habits that have been built up that feel like an uncontrollable addiction. But the root to them, if you actually understand them, allows you to penetrate and move them all together. And I think that's something important here around how do we get ourselves out of this. People often look at it and think that it requires so much effort to move everyone. And what we fail to remember is that there wasn't some massive coordinated effort to move everybody in one go to consumerism. Right. It happened by a series of small steps just like this that built up an addiction. Could we build up an addiction to wanting less? Could we use the very same tools to turn that on ourselves and go, I'm actually addicted to having far less than I need, far less than I've ever had before, and sharing that with people? What would that look like?
The word addiction is interesting too, right? Because I think that generally it's said that if you have an addiction, the first thing you need to do to treat it is realize that you have an addiction, right? And I think that the overwhelming majority of people in our society would never even think that they do have an addiction to consumerism, right? But it's so ingrained in our society that and it starts at such a young age too, right? I think that most of us, don't even realize that we are tethered to this thing, and we're all just part of this system that needs us to keep buying, to keep feeding it, right? So now we get to Kate Raworth's Doughnut economics. To explain it in the simplest of terms, anything inside or outside of the donut itself is less than ideal. People who are living in situations represented by the whole of the donut are lacking in all kinds of basic human needs. They don't have sufficient food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, or security. Anything outside the bounds of the donut represents an overshoot, which leads to environmental breakdown. As Kate says, we are currently both overshooting and undershooting all around the world. Ultimately, like with so many things, what we need is a balance. We need to stay within our limits. To do this, we need to embrace regenerative economics. We need to use circular systems where waste from one process feeds the next. Significantly, she says that even though it might feel like respecting our boundaries might feel limiting, it is precisely the fact of having boundaries that can often spur the greatest innovations. For example, Jimi Hendrix on only 6 strings of his guitars, or Serena Williams within the tennis court. When we set the parameters of how to have a healthy society, we will unleash all kinds of creative innovations and solutions that will hopefully propel us towards a greater, much better future. I completely agree that we have the tools at our disposal to change things and to be truly thriving, right? In terms of the technology, with AI and with all the other amazing technology that's coming out, we can certainly
be more abundant than we've ever been before. There's no question about that. And we are, and we see that right now. And she also talked about the new ways of distributing things, which are also growing in such amazing fashion. So there's no question that we can make what we need for everybody, and we can distribute what they need, what's needed to everybody as well, right? I think need is a big word there, obviously, too, right? Because there's such a difference between what we actually need and what we want or desire or think we need, right? That goes back to the Bernays stuff that we were talking about. I think that, so I'll say that I think that she's right, that we have the tools at our disposal. There's no question. I think what she's missing, in my opinion, is that to really get to the point where we're using those tools in the right fashion, we need to change the paradigm, right? Of why we're doing things and what we're doing it for, right? And I think she touched upon that, but to me, I think that's a huge part of the story, right? It's not just that we can do it, it's that we have to feel that we must do it. And that's what's really missing. And I think that feeling has to come first, and then everything's in place for us to do what needs to be done, right? That's my take. I don't know what you.
No,
what
I
your
think
thoughts are.
you've hit something really important there, Amos. I think it's we must feel that this is the only action to take. I think her point about constraints is really important. We tend to think that creativity comes from the lack of constraints, and it's actually the other way around. So we need the constraints, and the constraints around climate, and the constraints around culture, politics, everything that's happening right now, as unpleasant as it is creating constraints that are forcing us to be more creative. Just even look at what on AI, look at what DeepSeek did relative to OpenAI in developing a model that's as good, but on so much less in resources, and because they didn't have access to chips and whatever. So you can see those piece parts even now. But we're missing a story.
Yeah.
We're missing a thing to believe in, which is what comes after this. And it makes me wonder, right? Like, because did we sign up before for this because there was a story of what could come? Like, I wonder about the Bernays and other things like that. At some level, maybe in the past it was empires and monarchies and the force of law and rule. Maybe we can go back to other cultures and see, but there's an element of there was a story to believe in. And I think right now we're struggling with what that story is. We're hearing so many different things. We've each got something in our minds. We're hearkening back to a day when it was better in the past. And we're looking to the past to guide us. But I wonder how many of us really look and say, right now, today, how would I like to change or live my thing? Like if I made a decision today. Because she was right. The people from the past haven't lived with this system. How would we expect their theories and their ideas to work for us?
Yes. Yeah. Totally. And I like how you put that. You know, what's our story, right? Because I think that and this goes back to this whole title of humanity versus capitalism, right? And again, it's not about bashing capitalism, but capitalism is our story now. That's the thing, right? And it's really nothing else. I mean, you could talk about a lot of other things that you could say are part of the story, but the real overarching story in our society is capitalism. It's consumerism, right? And it's the one thing that almost everybody has bought into, pun intended, right? It is, you know, we've all pretty much as a collective said, yes, I'm buying into this. I need to get a job and get more stuff. And the more stuff I have, the better things are going to be. And I want that TV instead of that TV. I mean, that is the overarching story. And the societies that aren't in that story, they want to be in that story for the most part, right? I mean, that's what they seem to aspire to, right? And what is that story? It's ultimately, obviously, as we know, or a lot of us know, or a lot of us think, it's void of meaning at the end of the day, right? And it's spiritually empty, and it all it does is it just takes and takes and takes, right? And that's why in that donut that she's talking about, we're pushing these boundaries, or we've exceeded some of these boundaries, because it's all about taking and not giving. And that feeds into the whole regenerative thing, which is something I think that we'll save for another podcast, because I think that that's definitely a whole, but to me, that's a big part of the puzzle is the regenerative
Yeah,
technology.
it's a mechanism. It's a way of thinking about it. It's a way of bringing it. But I think it comes back down to, would you even, like, how much regenerative would you need if you didn't need as much stuff? Not that we wouldn't need it at all, but I think
Yeah.
you're raising the point, which is GDP and growth the flotsam we've clung on to in this ocean because we're lacking any other better story that guides us out of this, that keeps us afloat. We've lost religion, we've lost spiritual kind of pieces, we've lost lots of things that we used to have that were part of our psyche. And the rise of capitalism and the marketing around it and the cacophony, the noise of it, has overshadowed maybe what we intuitively know inside. And it's, is it the removal of these things, the subtraction of all these veils that are sitting over on top of a real story underneath it that we seem to be missing? We're just not quite cluing into, not quite seeing it right.
Yeah, right. It feels like our society is made up of distractions, right? And certainly with the phones and the internet, and it's just one distraction after another, and we're obsessed or addicted to our distractions, right?
Very true.
Yeah. I mean, and that now we're getting into a whole other realm of what meaning of life or what keeps you going and what makes you thrive as a human being, and that can emanate into what makes a whole society thrive, right? Going back to the first topic.
Like this, what this kind of brings up is, like, through Kate's kind of piece, she talks about these are all just stories. They're stories that have recent births in some ways, but might continue old patterns. But the nature of them is recent. Right. You were saying as well, they've been amplified by our recent technological advances, industrialization, mechanization, mass media, phones, internet. It's really been an amplification of something that's already been there.
Yeah.
And that kind of looking at the history, looking at historical figures for guidance, which is what we tend to look at and do, probably isn't going to guide us out of this one. It's going to need to be more present focused, a more constraint kind of oriented way of thinking, but constrained in the sense of there are some boundaries that we have to operate within physically, but maybe more expansive in our intellectual kind of thing. We're not constrained by the thinking patterns of our past kind of historians and things like that, or the victors' stories, which is kind of what we all have to live off of. Really, is they're the ones who rewrote the history books, and that's what we learned in schools. But how many stories have we missed because we've never had access to them that way? So
well, in a sense, I mean, I think that when you talk about the victors writing the story, right? I mean, that's what we're living in now in the post-Cold War, right? When we talk about capitalism's ascendancy, right? And I'm not trying to say that communism, the way it was espoused by the USSR, was something to aspire to, but the fact is that for whatever it was, about 40 years or so, 40, 50 years, that we had these two somewhat opposing ideologies. And then, as we get into the 90s and the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the Berlin Wall, right, goes down, that's become the story now, right? It's like, well, capitalism won, right? And capitalism was meant to win. It was inevitable. It feels like an inevitability right now. And I actually think that is what we're riding on. There's that kind of euphoria of capitalism's ascendancy starting around 89, 90, and we're still just, bam, on that spaceship, but it's going to crash, right?
This is really a question of, like, how do we get perspective to shift on a large global scale that doesn't feel like something to resist, but feels like a story worth believing in, a story worth putting everything into?
Yeah, great. Well put. I think we could conclude on that. That's a great summation. Yeah. Well, that was a lot of fun. That was the first podcast. I really thoroughly enjoyed that conversation, and Kate is such a brilliant mind. It was real pleasure to kind of expand on all these great ideas that she was putting out there in her talk. We'll be doing more of this. We plan on doing interviews as well, like live interviews with some of these wonderful thinkers who are changing perspectives and showing new ways of doing things. So we're really excited about doing more and more of that. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Hopefully you can keep joining us on this ride.